Before we dive into today's episode, we have some exciting news to share. Our spring cohort of the Next Economy MBA begins on March 28th, 2023, and we want you to join us. We designed the Next Economy MBA for entrepreneurs and change makers who are helping to create a world that works for all life. During this 9-month program, you'll learn practical skills on how to transform your organization into one that is just, equitable, and regenerative. Plus, you'll join an alumni community of over 400 impact leaders who are transforming organizations around the world. Interested in learning more? Visit lifteconomy.com/MBA to view our course curriculum and sign up for a free intro session with our facilitators. Thanks for listening, and now on to the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Wow, Eric Toensmeier, welcome. My name is Erin Axelrod, and I'm a partner at Lift Economy. And I'm so pleased to give this warm welcome to Eric, who is the author of Trees with Edible Leaves, The Carbon Farming Solution, and other books, including one I'm reading right now, Edible Forest Gardens. His work focuses on perennial crops and agroforestry systems and their role in climate change mitigation. Eric was a senior fellow with Project Drawdown and is today a senior fellow with the Global Evergreening Alliance. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, it's so great to have you. And well, the first place to start really is I'd love for you to share a little bit of your personal story and how it is that you came to be such an expert in edible leaves and plants and forest gardening and all the amazing work you do. How did you kind of come to this work?
Oh, sure. Well, my beginning into all this was through permaculture back in 1989 or 1990. And I've since sort of, branched out quite a bit, but that was really the beginning for me. And the part that I really liked was the idea of creating these living ecosystems that would provide food and other things that were like an extremely ecological way for people to interact with the landscape and meet their needs. And what I remember is reading these books. They were all from Australia, and they didn't feature a lot of plants that could grow where I lived. So I sort of began the process of saying, well, what could grow here? And that moved into what are the world's useful plants, especially the world's useful perennial plants, which is 30-some years later, very much still something I'm learning about on a day-to-day basis because there's a lot of them.
Do you remember how you first learned about permaculture?
Yeah, I was working at a nature center after high school in Philadelphia, and we were going to an education conference, and someone said, oh, you should go check out this talk on permaculture. So I went, and it turned out we had the first permaculture book, Permaculture 1, in the library back at the nature center. So I read that, and I was sort of hooked for life at that point. I said, that's what I want to do with my life, and that's what I did.
Amazing.
With my life. So I guess it stuck. It stuck. It has remained interesting all this time.
Well, and so many people have benefited from that voracious appetite of yours that has been interested in this topic ever since. So thank you for that. So for listeners who may not be familiar with the concept of a forest garden, could you share maybe anything that comes to you around defining that or how you've grown in your awareness of what that could be and what that could look like?
Sure. I guess there's a couple of ways to describe it. To the average American, we might say it's a very ecological form of edible landscaping that involves mostly perennial plants like fruits and nuts and so on, and perennial vegetables that live for many years. And those are mixed together with plants that fix nitrogen to provide fertilizer and plants that attract beneficial insects to help with pest control and ground covers to serve as a living mulch and help suppress weeds and all of those kinds of things, living together and working together in a way that is trying to mimic an ecosystem, and that itself becomes sort of a novel ecosystem, becomes a human-created ecosystem. And here in the US, that's kind of a new idea, or it's a new idea certainly in the last couple of 100 years, I would say, more or less here. Perhaps less on the West Coast, less time on the West Coast than here. But globally, it's a very old idea. There are people who've been doing this kind of, we call them tropical home gardens or multi-strata agroforests for at least 10,000 years. So it's an old notion that is kind of new here in our context. Although, again, if you look back at historic indigenous management of the East, there's an awful lot of resonance of the country as a whole, but particularly here in the East is where I've looked the most. There's a lot of resonance with this practice as well. It's not really something that comes from Europe, although there are some analogs there as well. And if I could change anything about that book now, it would be to look a lot more explicitly at those tropical systems and say, how can we apply their insights here? Dave and I were a little worried. We didn't want to just take things from the tropics and assume they would work here because we have like a lot less sunlight and whatever. But all the traveling around the tropics I've done in the decades since says, no, it's pretty much the same thing. We just have to let more light in. We have to keep the trees farther apart and let some more light in. But it's pretty much the same thing as far as I can tell as that ancient and unbroken agroforestry practice, which you can still see all over the Caribbean, all over Mesoamerica, all over much of the world's tropics. It's very much still a living and thriving practice.
Mm. Yeah, I remember actually the first time I came into contact with a food forest was in Brazil when I was learning from the Movimento de Trabalhadoras Sem Terra, the landless workers movement.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that is important for context, why we might consider doing these food forests, is that so much of how many of us in the United States, so-called United States, many of how we source our food results in such big environmental impact. And could you talk a little bit about sort of, in your book, you talk about this vision of what the resilience of communities could look like if there were these forest meadows and healed waterways and increased biodiversity. Could you talk a little bit about that vision?
Sure. I mean, I think if those kinds of landscapes became the norm again, a lot of things would be different. Like in terms of the fragmentation of habitats, a lot of the issues with loss of biodiversity and reduced habitat for wildlife and so on is that there's nowhere for them to go, or there's no way for them to get from one place to another. So a little tiny backyard forest garden like the one that I had until very recently in here in Massachusetts, we were there for 17 years. It's still going strong, still doing all these things. Is an island, is an urban biodiversity island. It's a place for migrating birds to come through. It's a place for some amphibians showed up, which was surprising. It's a place where insects can live their whole life. Many kinds of insects live their whole life in that garden, but it's not big enough on its own. And this was 1/10 of an acre. That's not big enough to provide the kind of habitat that's really needed for something larger than an insect, and not really big enough to have the kind of populations of insects you'd really like. But if every garden is like that, or if lots of gardens are like that, then you can, at the very least, they can serve as a corridor between one intact piece of habitat and another. And in a certain sense, they become themselves a habitat. I don't see that there's really a conflict between at least providing some kinds of habitat and some kinds of the sort of benefits and functions of ecosystems with providing human needs. It can be done. And I think so often it's sort of framed as like, well, you have to choose. Are we going to produce a lot of food in one place, and if we do that, then we can restore ecosystems somewhere else? But the notion of like that we can sort of have our cake and eat it too there, I think is underexplored and has been has been a lot of fun for us over the years in that garden. And it's interesting to go to places where that kind of gardening is the norm, and see the kinds of animals that are hopping around from place to place, to see like the hummingbirds moving around from garden to garden, things like that, while people are getting their avocados and their chayotes and the leaves they use to wrap their tamales and everything else. There's not necessarily a conflict there, although certainly you need to choose your priorities, and you can't maximize every priority all the time in every garden and in every space. But a lot more can be done than we're doing now. I think in this country, in our landscaping, we could almost not get worse for most of what we're doing.
Yes, we are infamous for having lawns be the largest irrigated crop in this country, which is really, if you think about all the chemicals that are dumped on lawns and going into our waterways, oy.
And then we bag it up and throw it in the trash. Which just is something that can't go on forever. Here in Massachusetts, I was part of this soil carbon plan for the state, and we learned that, I think it was 11% of the state is in lawn or other landscaping, and 9% is impervious surfaces, meaning like pavement or buildings. So here it's a very highly developed part of the country, but that's what we're working with out here. And certainly there's parts of California that are easily at that density or worse. And those are the places that we have to try and turn around. Those are really key places that are in need of attention and work, I think. Yeah, they have a lot of room to improve their soil and biomass carbon storage. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, especially when we saw the recent storms in California. I think it was 1 trillion gallons of water on certain areas of California, or maybe the whole state, in like 1 or 2 days. These atmospheric rivers and lawns are not as good as food forests, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And certainly all our pavement, and we could do so much with conservation hydrology to have curb cuts and really welcome some of that water to infiltrate and grow trees, which brings us to this kind of twofold questions. One is, what are some positive indicators you've seen since you wrote Edible Forest Gardens in 2004 in terms of people or communities moving towards that vision? And then what more needs to happen to accelerate that transformation?
Sure. Well, as to the first one, it's quite interesting, actually. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has an agroforestry division, and they've recently added urban food forests as one of the official categories of agroforestry that USDA recognizes and tries to promote. So that alone is a pretty serious piece of recognition, which I would never have seen coming personally. And there's been really just an explosion of these kind of public food forest projects around the country. There are lots and lots of people out there gardening in this kind of a fashion. I know there are more than 20,000 copies of the book have been sold, and there's lots of other books on the same subject. So I think there are a lot of people thinking about it and practicing it in a way that really was not the case when we were working on it. We started in 1997, and that was really very much a strange new idea to people at that time. And I think it has become much more widely understood. At the same time, it has to be way less than 1% of U.S. landscapes or even U.S. food gardens. So there's plenty of room left to go. And as the question of what it would take to do that, that's interesting. I mean, I feel like there's materials out there, there's educational materials out there, there's videos, there's books, there's classes and all of that. It would be great to see, as you and I were discussing earlier, to see like the networks of master gardeners take that on as a part of their curriculum and efforts nationwide. It would be great to see wherever there's actually still cooperative extension that works with people on gardening. That would be a great thing to see. But I think, there's some cultural shifts that need to happen around things like lawn and around things like people being embarrassed to grow food in a part of their yard that can be seen. In fact, in quite a few, I just read a statistic on this and I can't remember, but a shocking amount of the United States residences are in areas with homeowners agreements that often explicitly ban people from growing food and explicitly require very particular, detailed lawn care practices and stuff. So there's sort of a policy shift there. I'm not exactly sure what that looks like, but there were some people recently, I want to say it was in the Southeast somewhere, maybe in Virginia or North Carolina, who beat their homeowners agreement, I think at the state level in court, that they were allowed to do things like plant things for birds and stuff finally. So there's sort of like removing some policy obstacles there. There's some cultural shifts of different kinds. And I think actually an interesting way to get at this has been thinking about climate change adaptation. I've done a couple of workshops for that master gardener type audience on climate change adaptation in the garden. And it turns out that a lot of the things that are done in an edible forest garden in terms of having a lot of perennials and having a lot of living cover and all of that are really important adaptation strategies. And reducing tillage and so on, all those things really help. So I think there's an angle there. And as, not that we want it to happen this way, but as increasing, climate related disasters happen and as challenges like eggs costing more and limited availability of food during pandemics and things like that, it starts to make more and more sense to people to grow some of their own food. And while I think people want to start with the things they know and love, like tomatoes and stuff, and that's great, or berries, a sort of additional challenge is that some of the best perennial plants that we can grow that will produce food easily with very little pest and disease problems are not necessarily well known to the average American. So there's a challenge there of people sort of deciding to fight for things like apples and peaches, which may have a lot more pest and disease problems, less where you live than where I live, but still some, versus growing things that are very easy but less well known, like jujubes, for example, which are such a great choice for so much of the country, and yet very little known and grown, I think, here compared to what their potential is, let alone some of the trees with edible leaves that we may talk about later that are amazingly nutritious, but really are a big stretch for most of us from like lettuce and spinach or something.
I love it. Let's get into it because I'm chomping at the bit to get into talking about the move from your annual kale that comes, you seed it every year and replant it, to something like a purple tree collard, which is kind of, I know in your manual you mentioned it has to be staked to grow into a tree, but other tree-based leaf crops. So tell us about this new global manual that you've just released and how this can be helpful for folks just maybe getting into or wanting to grow more of their vegetables on trees.
Sure. Okay. I guess the big context is that I think it's again a very new idea in the United States, broadly speaking, that has been done in the tropics for thousands of years, and in fact has been very actively practiced in temperate Asia also for thousands of years, and particularly at the moment is quite a hot item there these days. So we're really just behind the rest of the world. And when you hear people say, like, when it comes to climate change, what we need to do is follow the lead of the global south, follow the lead of the tropics, follow the lead of people of color, take the ideas and practices that they've developed and listen. And this is an example of that, I think. You want to follow that lead and without stealing it and claiming all the credit for yourself, right? So trees with edible leaves are common around the world. I think as the world becomes more and more urbanized, they're sort of falling out of favor, but there's lots and lots of them. There's even a few that are from Europe that are traditional crops in Europe. There's quite a few that will grow in the temperate United States, a dozen or more. And the trick with them is that you don't really let them grow to full tree size most of the time because it's hard to climb a tree to pick leaves. And because we tend to prune them, somewhere between ground level and like 5 or 6 feet high every year or every few years. And the advantage of that is not only that you can reach it and pick it, but also that that resprouting growth will stay tender for a long season. For me, that's usually between like May and September. There'll be edible leaves every day between May and September, sometimes into October. Whereas if you were to just leave those trees alone and pick them only when they're tender, you might get 2 weeks of edible leaves, and that's it. So it makes a huge difference in terms of the availability through this season. And the advantage of them is they're super easy to grow. Really, sometimes all you have to do is cut them back once a year and pick. That's about it. So compared to, growing spinach or lettuce that have to be reseeded many times through the season, or even kale that has to be replanted every year, it's quite a bit less work. In fact, a friend of mine who at the time was running a gardening program in Mozambique for people with HIV said that they found trees with edible leaves were absolutely their biggest hit because they were much easier. They're so much less labor for people to have to manage them. And you don't even have to bend over for harvest. So they set a very high bar for ease of care. And most of the species we have are quite resistant to pests and diseases and are mostly not related to the other crops we grow. So they don't share pests and diseases. Again, most of them with things like the tomato family or the squashes or whatever, they're distant enough to have a groundhog will still go for them either way. But a lot of the more specialized plant diseases and pests just have no interest in these crops. They don't know what to do with them. So that's an advantage as well. And I find that most of the herbaceous perennial vegetables are more like early spring for us. And I think on the West Coast are more like winter crops, many of them. But these trees with edible leaves will really go all through the season. So it's not that I don't plant some kale too, because I love kale, but they have a long season and they just don't take that much work. Some of them taste unscary, taste familiar, and some of them are really different flavors, which can be good or bad, I think, for people. And they're really, as a group, they're with exceptions, but generally speaking, they're an extremely nutritious group of crops, especially in the nutrients that are desperately missing in the diets of billions of people around the world, very much including people in the United States. We're in a very serious health crisis of people not getting enough of certain vitamins and minerals and fiber here. And some of these trees are among the very best of all vegetables in the world for their ability to provide those nutrients that we so desperately need.
And I remember when you were first talking about this manual, that was one of the driving factors behind writing it was actually kind of this really sweet, beautiful marriage between the nutrition benefits of these trees with edible leaves and the climate benefits, and sort of, feeding two birds with one stone by disseminating this type of information to communities that are in this need of these nutrient-dense foods.
Yeah, that was really fun to sort of see how they may not sequester as much carbon as a full-size tree, of course, but they'll do an awful lot better than spinach will or something. And again, I love spinach too. I grow it in my greenhouse right now. But because they don't require tillage, you don't have to turn over the soil, because they're perennial, because they have these deep woody roots, they do a great job of building carbon in the soil. And however much sort of trunk and branches is left above ground and not cut back every year represents a substantial store of carbon as well. So they mitigate climate change very well. And they also are outstanding at adapting to it. They're not likely to blow away in a rainstorm or to be washed away in a rainstorm. They do a great job of fighting erosion, and increased rainfall intensity is something we see and will see more and more of with climate change. Means that erosion control is so much more important than it already even was. So woody perennials are pretty important for that. Because they're deep-rooted woody perennials, they're able to extend the growing season, let's say in the tropics, well into the dry season. But even in temperate places, through a long, dry summer without irrigation, they'll stay green when annual vegetables might die without irrigation. So that kind of drought resistance is more and more important because globally the pattern we're seeing is longer dry periods between rain events. And when the rain events come, there's super intense rain events. So we need to be retooling landscapes, our gardens and farms to welcome and catch and infiltrate that water when it comes, but also to drought proof them as much as we can also. So they really have a role in all of those pieces, the mitigation, the adaptation, nutrition, and some of them yield very well. Some of them are highly productive and yield as well or better than things like cabbage or lettuce or spinach that we're accustomed to growing and eating as vegetables now. So that's all pretty fun. That's great. And we found over 100 species that are grown for their edible leaves, let alone the hundreds of others that have edible leaves, many of which are often sold in markets or wild harvested and sold in markets. So those would be great candidates for sort of the next round of these species to start to bring into cultivation. If people already like it enough to buy it, they probably like it enough to grow it. So it may not be such a leap. And I'm sure there are many more species being grown for their edible leaves that we just weren't able to confirm that they were cultivated for this book. I'm sure there's another 40 or 50 or 100 species out there that are being grown somewhere in someone's garden that we just didn't find out about.
So when you were speaking about the flavor profile, I had an insight around another way to accelerate this. We got to get some top prominent chefs integrating these tree leaves into their menus and sort of popularize it that way. And I love that your manual is downloadable now on the Perennial Ag Institute website. So folks who are listening and are interested in diving deeper can just go there and download it. That's an amazing gift, and really appreciate you for doing that. Would you be willing to kind of give our listeners a peek into a day in the life and maybe even share some of the specific names of the types of trees that, like, what is, Eric, what do you do when you're integrating these into your diet? Like, how does that flow in your daily life to go out there, harvest some leaves, make a stir fry? Could you kind of bring us into a picture of how this could look?
Sure. Yeah, well, I've been fortunate enough to live with these plants for maybe a dozen years or so now, for quite some time. So in the winter, this time of year, it might be going around and pruning, which is so quick and easy. You're just I cut the whole thing off at about 4 feet high, and that's it. So that couldn't be an easier job. And I usually do that once a year, but sometimes in midsummer, I'll go out and do another cut if they're getting too tall and I can't reach them anymore. Let's see, during the time of year when they're producing, I do sometimes actually freeze some as well to have it available in the winter. Let's see, well, I'll go out for a little stroll around the garden, and let's say I'm making soup, then I'll think about what might be good. In that case, I have a couple of favorites for soup. The best certainly is Chinese tune, which basically tastes like chicken soup already. It's quite striking. It just really tastes like chicken soup. I've never seen anything like it. And I think, by the way, for people who are working towards really plant-based diets and stuff, having some chicken flavor every once in a while can be really nice. It makes a wonderful chicken stock. So I'll pick the younger, more tender shoots of that and bring them in. I also like to get the leaves of linden. They don't have a particularly strong flavor, but they're actually related to okra, so they have a nice thickening effect on a soup, which is great. Let's see, what other ones do I... Well, okay, the edible leaf goji, that's mostly sort of a spring vegetable. I'll just go out and eat the shoots raw because I love them. In midsummer, if you cut it back, they'll give you a nice second crop. And in that case, I'll pick the whole top like 8 to 10 inches when it's kind of tender and rubbery, and you can cook that whole thing, leaves and stems and all. That has sort of like a mildly mustardy, slightly bitter flavor that I really like. And mulberry leaf is one of my favorites. And the trick there has been to find the mulberry varieties that actually have good leaves, because some of them are the texture is sort of a little too much like blue jeans or something, very, very textile-ish, very fibrous. And some of them, the flavor isn't that good. So we're still, I would say in the US, we're still trying to figure out which varieties have the best flavor and texture. Several have been selected, and some people are even selling them now. So with mulberry, how do I like to eat the edible leaf mulberries? One of the ways that I've had it that I like best is sort of a Mexican lasagna. At Las Cañadas in Mexico, they'll do like a layer of tortillas and a big thick layer of the mulberry leaf, tender young mulberry leaf, and then a bunch of cheese and a bunch of salsa, and then do that again several times, and they'll bake that whole dish for a long time. I will admit I don't usually get that sophisticated at home, but I'll cook them up with fried rice or with scrambled eggs or in frittatas. It's nice to know that when I'm cooking something like that, when I'm cooking particularly, let's say, the mulberry and the Chinese tune, that they're really 2 of the 10 most nutritious vegetables in the whole world based on our analysis of over 200 species of vegetables when it comes to the nutrients that people are missing, whether it's the ones people are missing, what they call traditional malnutrition that rural folks tend to be lacking in the tropics, or if it's the industrial diet deficiencies from what Americans are missing from our diet. Both of those species are very high in all of those nutrients, or almost all of those nutrients. So it's very satisfying to know that you're not just eating vegetables, but you're really eating some of the very most good for you vegetables in the world. I appreciate that anyway, for sure. And it's taken a little while to figure out, what stage you want to harvest them at. I tend to like them when they're very tender, and which ones are the best for this and that kind of dish, and so on. I'm excited this year. I'm growing a bunch of new ones. So part of it is also learning to grow trees from seed, because some of these you can't get from any nursery right now, or to do root cuttings or some other kinds of somewhat, I think, more obscure kinds of propagation. Once we get things up and running, that these will be available from nurseries more, and it'll be easy to go and get them. Like you can buy Chinese tune now from lots of nurseries, or from some nurseries anyway. But I've got a couple of Siberian ginsengs that I'm growing out because they are also an outstanding leaf vegetable. So I have to learn how far apart to plant them. I mostly at my old house had them in a hedgerow, which was great. But here I'm going to do big blocks because I want so much. I never had enough Chinese tune at the old house. I only had a couple of trees. So I'll have 9 or 12 here. I'm getting pretty serious about it. Because it took a while to get used to it, but now I can't get enough of that one. I think it's quite extraordinary vegetable.
Wow. My neighbor has some, Jessica Bates, and so I will be helping her propagate some more so we have more regionally. But I'm also going to bring this question to our California Rare Fruit Growers Scion Exchange this weekend, and I'll be bringing a question of, what's the tastiest leaf mulberry? And I might get some perplexing looks because that group tends to be biased towards the fruit, but we'll see how we do.
They do, and they should be, they should expand their horizons. They already have all the skills. Yes. They already have all the plants. It's really just a matter of going around in spring and collecting leaves from the various mulberry varieties and cooking them up and seeing which ones are good. And in many cases, they're already commercially available. Like Illinois everbearing isn't bad, but also we can do them from the wild mulberries if you live where there's wild mulberries. Some folks in Florida selected one called Edible Leaf, which is great. So, and that's commercially available now. So we're just at the beginning stages, I think, of a lot of this here. It is a time when those serious fruit enthusiasts and others who love plants can really step in and start to make a difference here. And I think there's a niche for nurseries and so on who want to make these things happen as well.
I've been playing around recently with making purple tree-colored kraut. Have you made any krauts or fermented foods with your edible tree leaves?
I mostly haven't yet, but I really should. I've done more with the herbaceous perennials, actually, like the tree collards and some of the perennial alliums and stuff. Now that I will have more, I mostly have had small enough numbers of those plants because the garden was so small that I ate everything fresh. But I'm really excited now to have the opportunity to do more of that with them.
Yeah.
And certainly that is done in other parts of the world with these plants. So it's not there's no reason you can't do it.
And I love too, earlier when we were talking, that you brought in the economic advantages of these plants in terms of not only just, reducing transport costs, reducing input costs, increasing nutrient portfolios. I'm even thinking about folks with backyard chickens being able to offset a tremendous amount of the feed costs by, feeding them leafy greens, which is, increases the omega-3 and omega-6 values in the eggs. And is there anything else you'd want to say just around, from like an economic standpoint, around why folks should get interested in this?
Well, you don't have to buy seed every year or buy seedlings every year. They produce really well for the estimated lifespan is somewhere between 20 and 30 years. So that's pretty good. And often the initial investment, some of these trees like lindens and stuff, often you can get for $1 or $2. So I would say that's a very good, a couple of decades of vegetables for $2 is a pretty good deal. Even for $20 is a pretty good deal. And considering also that they do sidestep a lot of the pests and disease problems, and they don't need the same amount of fertilization either. Trees tend to need a lot less fertilization than annual crops because they have such deeper roots. You can really save a lot of money. And again, in this period of time when we're not always sure if there's going to be fresh food on the shelves at the supermarket, it's nice to have them as a backup. You don't even have to eat them. You could feed them to chickens or rabbits, or you could just mulch them at the end of the year or something. But they seem like a very, very good backup plant. For me, they're really front and center as the main dish. But maybe someone's sick or you're busy in the family and you're not able to plant your annuals every year. But these will always be there for you. And that's a pretty significant thing, I think, in terms of increasing resilience. And I think they're great for the borders of community, not just for the home garden, the borders of community gardens, pick your own areas of CSA farms and things like that. I think they have these kind of public food forests. I think they're great. Having a block of them is a great choice for those kinds of things. Even along the contour for erosion control in other kinds of vegetable farms. I don't think their commercial applications in the U.S. are the front and center. I think more we're at the stage of getting people to grow them at home. But that's where we were with forest gardens 25 years ago. And now the home version of that is pretty well done. And we're starting to see more and more farms figure out how to make that a commercial model. It may be a similar kind of process here with trees with edible leaves, that they start at home and then they gradually work their way out from there as chefs pick them up and get excited about them and so on.
Eric, I'm so glad you brought up this last piece around community gardens, and I'm sensing we're going to have to bring our conversation to a close soon-ish, but because of the land access inequities in this country and the wealth inequities in this country, I think that's such an important point to kind of start coming to a close on, is that you'd be surprised how many community gardens are open-armed, willing to bring new ideas, new energy, and collaborate. And for those, just a PSA, for those that might be passing through or live in Seattle, the Beacon Hill Food Forest, I had a chance to visit there on a train ride up there last September. And that's a 1 acre food forest right 5 minutes from downtown Seattle. And more I'm seeing these communities. So I love that you mentioned that, because you don't have to own your own land. You can be a renter and be a part of a community food forest that you can oftentimes source a lot of free food from just by volunteering and getting involved.
And then propagating material as well. Once you're ready with your own land, you can get your cuttings or seed or whatever you need from there to move on. A lot of these are pretty easy to grow. A lot of these trees with edible leaves are pretty easy to grow once you have access to a mature plant. I think they're very important for those kinds of gardens. And I see lots of community gardens with interesting things happening around the edges, or a little open area, or an area with a little shade for people to sit or for meetings to happen, where people are growing fruits and berries and other things. And why not add some of these other plants? I'll add that some of them really have cultural resonance with some of the places that immigrant and migrant and refugee communities have come from. So a lot of our trees with edible leaves are from Eastern Asia. They're from South Korea, from China. the ones that can grow even in cold places here. And then if you're in warmer parts of, let's say, Southern California or Florida, you see people growing all kinds of amazing tree vegetables from all over the world in South Florida, including growing them commercially and selling them to other immigrants from the same communities. So I think mostly they've kind of snuck the cuttings and seeds of those plants in. But in many cases, they're already here and being grown as ornamentals. And actually, people all over the world eat mulberry leaves in Central America, in the Himalayas, in parts of Mexico, in parts of Africa. They're already parts of, like Uzbekistan and stuff. So many of the people who are arriving here from other parts of the world, these trees are part of their cuisine and their way of life already. So it's really not so much trying to force something new on people as trying to bring something that anchors them to home a little bit, and depending on who's there and where they're from and all of that.
Eric, we are running out of time. I'm so grateful for this conversation, and we'll have to do a part 2 sometime. Is there anything you'd like to share with our listeners around more info about how they can access this information, how they can learn from you,
Sure.
or any just last words around to inspire action and motivate people to get involved?
Sure. Well, if they're looking for the book, they can download a copy for free at perennialagriculture.institute. It's been up, I think, for 3 weeks now, and it's already had 15,000 downloads. So free is really good. And that is really almost every country in the world has had at least one person download it. So we're off to a great start. We're working on a Spanish translation as well. So they could go there and read more about that if they like. That would be a great place to begin. And they can find me on Facebook and on Patreon, actually, and at the Perennial Agriculture Institute. And I'm about to get my regular website, perennialsolutions.org, back online. And that will have a whole bunch of workshops and webinars and things on it if people wanted to learn more. There are also some great places to see collections of these plants if you're in the U.S. There's a number of nice collections in South Florida, including at ECHO, the Educational Concerns for Hunger organization. You can find some of these plants at Occidental Arts and Ecology Center in California. And some of the nurseries on the West Coast are starting to pay more attention to these things, like Rain Tree and One Green World. So those would be interesting places to see those things as well. Get your hands on the plants.
Yes, love it. Oh, we will definitely help share out the word about your workshops, and that sounds exciting. Thank you so much, Eric. This has just been such a pleasure having you on the show, and we can't wait to have you back.
Well, anytime, and I'm very happy to be here, and would like to say thanks to Trees for Climate Health, which is a project of Jonas Philanthropies, for helping to fund the work, to Interlace Commons, which was our fiscal sponsor for the project, and to my Patreon patrons who helped to support the writing. So it's a big community project to make this thing come out, and there'll be more to come.
Thank you, Eric. So much heart and spirit and soul went into this project. So thank you for your efforts, and can't wait to get our hands dirty, as you said, planting some of these amazing plant partners. Take good care. Talk soon.
You too.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.